But we'll go ahead and get started. I would ask, of course, to keep your microphones on mute during the presentation. If you have any questions or think of any questions during the presentation, you can list them in the chat box. And Thom is going to take those at the end. As it is being recorded. And that's on, right, Emily? Okay. Well, thank you all for joining us tonight. My name is Linda Sampson. I am a Seneca Lake Pure Waters board member and head of the Invasive Species Committee at the association. I guess I can get this started. We are a nonprofit organization. We have a director and an assistant director. Those are the two paid positions. And the rest of us are just dedicated volunteers, many volunteers, 20 of which who are board members. And we do a wide variety of tasks. We operate to educate the public and collect data. We partner with organizations such as the Department of Environmental Conservation, PRISM, the Partners for Regional Invasive Species Management across New York State, and Finger Lakes Institute with Hobart William and Smith College. And those organizations translate our data into action. We are always in the market for volunteers and donations. You can do both of those at our website, senecalake.org. This is a slide that shows some of the things we care about and collect data on. And during National Invasive Species Week, we are so lucky to have gotten Thom Allgaier to come and talk about two invasive species that will be in our backyards very soon, unfortunately. Thom has over 20 years experience dealing with invasive species. He has worked in landscape construction, garden centers, and greenhouses. His education started with an associate's degree in ornamental horticulture from Farmingdale State University. He went on to get a bachelor's of science from Empire State College in environmental biology, and then a master's degree from University of North Carolina at Wilmington in environmental science. And he is currently the Invasive Species Coordinator with New York State Department of Agriculture and Markets. So I will turn the screen over to Thom.
Thank you, Linda. I did notice in your opening the beautiful shot of Seneca Lake and all that beautiful farmland. So it's closely, just a good illustration of how it's closely tied together.
Yeah.
I had no idea you were going to post that. It was great to see. So thanks for having me, and great job on pronouncing my difficult to pronounce last name. But yes, I'm Thom Allgaier. I'm the Invasive Species Coordinator within the Division of Plant Industry at the New York State Department of Agriculture and Markets. So I'm going to share my screen. Bear with me one second. There we go. Is it still in presenter mode, or do you see the full screen?
Full screen, it looks great.
All right, thank you. Tonight I'm going to talk about mostly Spotted Lanternfly and Box Tree Moth. I'm going to touch on two other things briefly. One is related, and the other one is kind of a preemptive, mentioning that I think there's one or two spots on that. So again, Spotted Lanternfly and Box Tree Moth, specific to your area, they're both in the region. First, I'm going to go into Box Tree Moth. Beautiful little nondescript white and gray or white and brown moth. What you'll notice is the little apostrophes on the leading edge of the wing. It looks almost like a half moon, like a crescent moon shape. That's an identifying factor because there's lots of white moths. However, this one has those matching little crescent moons on its wing, and there's two different color combinations that this occurs in. I'll get to that later. But regardless of the color, whether it's the light morph or the dark morph, they both have these little crescent moons. They're primarily active at night, so generally a little bit harder to see. Like most moths, they're active at night, where most butterflies are active during the day. Here's one of our horticulture inspectors. Actually, she's now our Cooperative Agricultural Pest Survey Coordinator, Jamie Lynn Woodside. She generally works used to work in the Buffalo area. However, now she covers the whole state of New York for our CAPS program, which is our Cooperative Agricultural Pest Survey, which is a visual and trapping survey of agricultural pests that are not known to exist in New York State. So this is one pest that we've been aware of and been concerned with for several years. Back in 2018, it was found in Toronto, Canada, as many of our most recent introductions have, for agricultural pests at least, have been first introduced into Canada as invasive species and then spread across the border. In 2019, Box Tree Moth was one of our CAPS our CAPS targets. We did not find any. In 2020, during the pandemic, things were a little bit challenging, but we did some targeted trapping in areas where we thought it might cross the border along the St. Lawrence and along Lake Ontario. However, nothing was found. And then in 2021, we found it in Niagara County, and it has slowly spread south and east, primarily east along the lakeshore since then. Late in 2021, we enacted a quarantine, including 2 counties as buffers. So the initial quarantine was 3 counties. That following spring, the USDA also issued a quarantine mirroring our 3-county quarantine. Later in the spring, they also issued a federal order prohibiting the importation of euonymus holly or ilex and boxwood, which is buxus, from Canada. However, holly and euonymus have never been, they're listed as hosts in its native range in Asia, in Western Asia. However, in Europe and in North America, it's never been found on those as hosts. So we're not so much concerned with euonymus and holly as we are with boxwood. We have expanded the quarantine additional times. The first time back in September of 23, and then again last fall. The presence known at this point, this map really hasn't changed much since the end of last summer. All the red marks are positive trap finds or positive detections, and you can see how it's kind of spread slightly south and then eastward along the lakeshore from the original 3 counties. So originally in Buffalo and then spreading out from there. However, we anticipated it's flying better than it was, than what it was anticipated to. And it's also being carried on the wind currents. So we're anticipating it to spread further south into the Finger Lakes. We're not the only ones dealing with this in the United States. There are other locations marked by the blue stars. Those were nursery introductions. It certainly didn't fly over the border to Massachusetts, but there were nursery plants that were infested that were shipped from Canada into the United States. And those accidental introductions were responsible for these other locations. The one that concerns us more so is the location there in Massachusetts. It's not far from the east end of Long Island, where there's a lot of nurseries, a lot of growers, and a lot of old boxwood plantings. It's called Box Tree Moth because in Europe, they call it box tree. They have natural forests of it. It's naturally occurring. Here, it's an introduced plant. It's not invasive, but it's an introduced plant. It's non-native. And here in the United States, we call it boxwood. So it's a bit of a tongue twister for me to kind of switch between boxwood and box tree. So I apologize if I bite my tongue on that a few times. Um, but right between those two blue stars are where it's known. The first introductions in New York State, and then Massachusetts introduction. What's about halfway in between the Finger Lakes? So you're kind of sandwiched in between two known populations, with the Pennsylvania population really not that far away. New quarantine, as I mentioned, originally it was 3 counties, then it was a few more were added last year. I guess it was last spring. I thought it was the end of summer, but last spring we expanded the quarantine area to 34 counties. However, I showed you where the known locations are. This is where we anticipate it to spread to. We don't anticipate it to spread eastward through the Adirondacks. However, along the St. Lawrence, it has that natural flow of the western wind currents carrying it, and it's slowly going to move south. The current quarantine has increased, as I mentioned, to 34 counties. So what does that mean? So it means that movement of host material, which is boxwood or box tree, boxwood is what I'll keep calling it. So host material from within the extended quarantine, those 34 counties, is allowed to freely move within those counties, but and it does not require a compliance agreement. However, the material must be inspected and be free of box tree moth, and that those inspections are done by our inspectors as well as the nurseries that they're located at. Infested material is written a treatment order. The material is quarantined on site and cannot be moved until it's either destroyed or treated and found free of box tree moth. They are allowed to move plant material outside of those 34 counties into other parts of New York State and other states as well. However, they need a compliance agreement, which is basically just an agreement saying that they'll follow certain parameters. That being a pest management plan in place, trapping for box tree moth, routine inspections by them and us. When I say us, I'm not physically out doing the inspections, but one of our many horticulture inspectors are, and then we cover the whole state. We have every county in the state has a horticulture inspector assigned to it. If treatments are needed, and then also pre-clearance for if it's going to a foreign state. So and when I say foreign state, I mean like Pennsylvania, Oregon, Hawaii, and anywhere that's not in New York. The pupa are very difficult to find. It looks like a small rolled up piece of paper. Here you can see Jamie Lynn Woodside, and she found one after picking around for quite a while and pulled it out. You can see, it's about a little bit smaller than the width of your finger. It really does look like a small piece of rolled up paper. However, on the left side, it's very difficult to find. As the leaves start to desiccate and they dry up, they turn brown. It camouflages really well. But right in the center of that photo, there's a pupa. Very difficult to find. I have to move this box over a little bit. I don't know if you can see that on your screen. There we go. So it's very difficult to find. They're about 3/4 of an inch long, or almost as wide as your finger, and they look like paper. So there it is. I forgot that little feature was there. So for much more in-depth information and up-to-date information, we have partnered, as we usually do, with Cornell Crawford Extension, or actually, sorry, Cornell Integrated Pest Management, which is different than the Extension Service. It's still part of the land-grant college. However, they have a separate page for box tree moth, and there's a wealth of information there about this, and photos and tips, and also pesticides that are listed that can be used for treatments. New York State Department of Agriculture cannot prescribe or recommend any specific pesticide treatments. However, Cornell can. So that's kind of where the partnership comes in. And they also update their information much more rapidly than we can. Ours is more basic. Theirs is much more detailed. So it's a great partnership. Again, I mentioned pesticides. So any pesticides that are labeled and safe and registered for use in New York State, just because the pesticide says it can be used for box tree moth, it may or may not be registered in New York State. The list that's available through Cornell Integrated Pest Management lists everything that's available to homeowners, as well as there's a separate list for commercial applicators, which would be tree care companies and nurseries and things like that, people with pesticide application licenses from the DEC. So those resources are there through Cornell. And here's another great shot of a adult box tree moth on some dead boxwood. The eggs, however, are also even more difficult to find than the pupa. If anyone's ever seen a boxwood, the leaves are about the size of your pinky nail. They're kind of concave, kind of curled, and they're kind of dark green and glossy on top and light green and glossy on the bottom. So they're very small, and the egg mass covers only about a sixth of that surface area on the bottom of the leaf. So they're curled. So you have to lift the leaves over, look at them, and they blend in really well. And they're, during the summer heat and sunshine, it blends in really, really well. So the egg masses are pretty hard to find. They can lay up to 3 generations, at least that we've found so far in the northern part of New York State. In the southern part, it could be up to 3 to 5, well, up to 3. It could be up to 4 or 5 generations per year. They're difficult to detect, as I mentioned, because of the placement on the leaf and the coloration of the egg masses. The larva looks like a very indescript little green caterpillar with a black head, very similar to many others. However, the feeding pattern is very distinct. When they first hatch out, the very first infestation, they will feed on the leaves, but they will leave the midrib and the petiole and the outer leaf edge. So they're going for the soft tissue versus the harder stuff. So they have their first tasty meal, and they devour and defoliate very quickly. They defoliate the box tree or the boxwood. The second generations that come out, they hatch out. All that great prime real estate is already gone. So all they're left with is the midrib, the outer edges, the leaves, and the bark. So the second generation that comes out, which is a very short period of time, they will start gnawing on the bark and eat the bark, and that's really what kills the box tree, the boxwood. So they will defoliate at first, and then they girdle. They remove the bark from the tree, and then the boxwood shrub can't recover from that. It's a very slow growing plant, if anyone's familiar with them, which is part of the reason why they're so high value, dollar wise. They have a high aesthetic value as well because they're deer resistant. They're in a lot of many historic landscapes, whether it's cemeteries or public buildings, things like that. Um, Larger display gardens have some very old boxwood plantings that are just nearly irreplaceable because it takes 100 years, 50 years for these plants to reach maturity of a decent size. As I mentioned earlier, the adults are primarily found at night, like typical to most moths. They have the distinct little apostrophe or half moon crescents on their wings. On the bottom, you can see the crescents on the dark morph. However, the dark morph has not been found in North America yet, but the genetic mutation does happen, and that dark morph can appear in New York State. So just because you have a dark gray moth, dark brown moth, don't think it's not box tree moth, because it very well could be, but they'll always have that little crescent on the wings in the same location, regardless of the color morph. This is what it can do to box tree or boxwood. Complete devastation very quickly. This damage is pretty early on, and I would say that's probably about 2 weeks worth of damage from when they first hatched to this damage. So it happens very quickly for a very slow growing plant. The second generation, as I mentioned, will girdle the stems, and then there'll be just twigs left, similar to the photo I showed earlier with the adult on the completely bare twigs. That's what happens after the second and third generation. So all of a sudden, if your boxwood seem turning brown very quickly, this could be the culprit. We work with nursery growers and plant dealer establishments. Basically, the difference is the plant growers are growing the plants, and the dealers are buying them in and refilling them. So think of like the difference between like your mom and pop nursery versus CVS, or or someplace else that's selling plants. They all have to be registered with New York State as either a grower or dealer if they're selling potted or plants with roots. So to limit the human-assisted spread of box tree moth through sale of host material, we regulate it, as I talked about, in the quarantine. Our horticulture inspectors are specifically trained to survey for these. We also do trapping. I mentioned the state quarantine earlier. So the inspection is done by AGM, is Agriculture and Markets. It's the official acronym for my department. And we inspect that host material as well as all nursery plants that are either grown in or moved into the quarantine area, and then also being offered for sale or by compliance agreement if they're moving out of the quarantine area. So they have their hands full in those 34 counties. And here you can see another one of the larvae. Again, very early on in the feeding stage, because there's quite a bit of green foliage left, but you can see it just munching away on the edge of that leaf. And it's just like a typewriter back and forth. If the folks on this webinar are old enough to remember typewriters, like I am, but they just kind of go left to right and just kind of like a corn on the cob, and just keep going and eating it until it's gone. There are traps available for box tree moth. We trap around registered establishments within the quarantine. We also have additional trapping outside the quarantine to monitor for spread. So if you see these green topped yellow and white buckets hanging around, they're not for cigarette butts. They are for insects collecting box tree or sometimes other pests. We refer to these as bucket traps because they're bucket shaped. The top is just there to stop water from filling it. And you'll see this little red strip on the inside. That's like a pesticide strip to actually kill the insects as they fly in. But when we check this trap, you can see that there's a couple, looks like 3-4 adults. So in that one trap. So if you do see these hanging, say in a cemetery or somewhere else that has boxwood, you'll know what these traps are. And they are available commercially. They're not very cheap, and then the pesticides, the lure, and then the pesticide killing strip. You have to be a registered, certified nursery, a certified pesticide applicator with New York State DEC to use the kill strips. So reporting it, if you do think you have it, here's a good example. There's a dwarf Alberta spruce there in the back left, and then 2 very dead or soon to be dead boxwoods. Just because it's infested doesn't necessarily mean it's going to die. If you catch it right away, there's a chance that it can re-leaf and refoliate as long as it's not been girdled. But you have about a 2-week window from when it's infested to that point. And what happens more often than not is that by the time it's noticed and detected, if any treatments are done, it's usually into the 2nd and 3rd life stage, and then they start eating the bark, and it's just past that point. However, we do have a reporting site. It's a tool. Basically, it just takes some basic questionnaires. Where is it? What's the property? How big is the plant? GPS coordinates and photos. The photos are key so that we can determine that it's this and not something else. And then we're looking at the same plant, that it's not something like Korean boxwood, which is not buxus. It's actually a type of holly. So even though the common name says it's boxwood, Korean boxwood, but it's not really boxwood. When I say boxwood or box tree, I'm talking about the buxus genus. And then if you can't sleep at night and you really, really need to go to sleep, the quarantine regulations, the express terms are here at this link. You can read those. They're quite enthralling. It's a great read. It'll put you right to sleep. However, if there are, if legal reading is your thing, that's your place. Boxwood blight is one of those 2 things I'm going to mention that are not. Spotted lanternfly and boxwood moth. So boxwood blight is another invasive species. However, the damage of it from a distance looks very similar because all of a sudden your boxwood is turning brown. However, the leaves fall off. they're not eaten, they're not damaged. It's not just the midrib, the leaves just, you can see on the bottom right there, you'll see some spotting starting at the edge, working its way in. That's the way the mode of infection. So it'll start at the tip or the edge. It'll start to die there and then spread further in until the whole leaf is consumed and the leaves will fall off. So you'll find the dead leaves on the floor versus just pieces with box tree moth. So that's one factor that, so this pest from a distance looks very similar, but it's not the same. Also, the top photo there, you can see how on the right side, it's kind of spreading from left to right. There's a progression, just like on the leaves. So it'll infest a leaf and spread over, and it'll continue to spread slowly from that leaf to the next leaf to the next leaf until the plant is consumed. However, with box tree moth, they move around. They're very mobile. You'll also see lots of webbing, almost like spider mites, if you're familiar with those in your house plants. It's not there's not spiders in there, but it's webbing that the caterpillar produces. So you'll see lots of that webbing. That webbing will be absent with boxwood blight, unless you have both pests, which is theoretically possible. We have not seen that. So, a positive diagnosis for boxwood blight is only the only way to positively identify it is with a test at a laboratory. So a sample would have to be collected and sampled and sent to a lab. And the lab that we use is Cornell. This spreads very rapid in warm, humid conditions, which is the same time that boxwood is present. At 14 and a half hours of daylight, box tree moth goes dormant. It's like a light switch. We reach 14 and a half hours of daylight in the late summer, and they go into like a diapause. It's kind of a pause period, and they overwinter as a caterpillar. One of the very curious things about this pest, they don't overwinter as an egg or a pupa or in the soil. They overwinter as a caterpillar. Again, with boxwood blight, you'll see patchy segments where some of the plant is green, some of it is dead. So that's an indicator that it's this pest and not box tree moth. And the leaves will always have these spots on them. They won't be chewed, they won't be damaged. The leaves will still be whole, but they'll start to go from that beautiful green, apple green color to browns and yellows. The infested material can hold the pathogen for up to 5 years. So if you rake it up and put it in your compost, you're just saving it for next year. The best thing to do is rake it up, put it in your trash, and put that in a municipal waste stream or burn it. However, might be mindful of the DEC burn bans and things like that and local ordinances. And the same thing for testing. It's not the leaves and the twigs can also be tested as long as the pathogen is present. You're more likely to find it in the spring and fall when there's more moist conditions. So that is that. Nope, there's one more for boxwood. Fungicides are pretty much useless for boxwood blight. The best thing to do is destroy infected material, unfortunately, which means cutting off the base and destroying it. Plant alternative non-host material. And there is some research going on. There are some resistant cultivars. However, it's resistant to boxwood blight. They're not resistant to box tree moth. So just keep that in mind. Moving on to our other pest that you're probably more familiar with is Spotted Lanternfly. It's a plant hopper. It's not a moth. It's not a butterfly. It's not even a lanternfly. It's a plant hopper native to China and Southeast Asia. It's also invasive in parts of Asia, like South Korea and India. It was discovered in Pennsylvania, likely from an accidental introduction of stone material, benches and sculptures and things that came from India or China. That was discovered in 2014 and has very slowly spread out from there. I say slowly because we're 11 years into it now, and in South Korea, when it was first found, which is the same size as, say, Virginia, it took a year, and it was the entire country of South Korea. They were covered in the spotted lanternfly. So as much as it's spreading here in the U.S., we have slowed it down. There is no chance of eradicating this pest at this point, but we are in a management phase and a slow the spread phase. It uses its mouth parts. It has piercing, sucking mouth parts. Think like a mosquito, where a mosquito would kind of poke its mouth, its feeding tube into you and suck out blood. These basically do the same thing to plants. However, they're just filtering the sap. They're not sucking it out, but their mouth parts are like a straw. So they poke their mouth part into the plant. The sap pressure in the plant kind of pushes that through them, and their excrement is called honeydew. I'll get into that a little bit more later. But it's basically a mixture of the plant sap and their poo. Uh, their preferred host is another invasive species called tree of heaven, Alanthus altissima. Um, However, it has many other hosts, so like 120 other different host species, but some of them have huge economic importance, like grapes, apples, and hops. So if you like your wine and your hard cider and your beer, this is a threat. Maples, so maple syrup, also walnuts and other trees. And other shrubs like raspberry, blueberries, things like that, they'll feed on. Uh, But some of the impacts, besides the agricultural impacts, their feeding stresses plants, making them more vulnerable to other issues, other pests, other diseases. I mentioned the honeydew that they excrete. That honeydew gets covered on everything below it. It's a very sugary, sweet substance, and black sooty mold grows on it. You can see some examples here on the steps. The bottom step has been power washed. The other two steps are black and slippery and gooey looking. Even the blackness on that grape leaf or on this post, that's all black sooty mold. If you've ever grown roses, you've probably had aphids, and it's the same black sooty mold that grows on those. When you have aphids, you have honeydew as well. So it's that, but to a ginormous scale. I mean, everything underneath the plant that has it will be covered in this black honeydew, black powdery milk. Sorry, black. Sorry, the the yeah. Sorry, I tripped myself up. So the mold. Um, so also the thick sweet excretion, the honeydew, can start to ferment, and it'll get this foamy, frothy look to it, which is what you see in the top right photo here. Around the base of some trees. It looks like a fungal growth on the outside of the tree, and it's basically what it is. It's just there's so much honeydew that it's actually starting to ferment, and that will give off like a fermenting, rotting fruit type smell. If you've ever smelled rotting apples in an orchard, it smells very much like that. And that in the fall will attract stingy insects and other insects. So you'll get yellow jackets and European hornets and other things. I'm going to touch on the European hornets in a minute. But those other stinging insects are attracted to this sticky substance, this honeydew as well, because in the fall their resources are starting to dry up and disappear as flowers start to become less and less common. They're attracted to this honeydew. Um, so you may see swarming insects. You may see, more yellow jackets attracted to, some plants that you don't normally see them on. And this could be an indicator that there's spotted lanternfly population, even though you haven't seen the insects. So it impacts quality of life. I mean, no one wants to use their patio if it's covered in black sooty mold. See, my brain engaged there at that time. I couldn't trip myself up before, but the black sooty mold will coat everything underneath of it. I mean, cars, vehicles, play toys, RVs, picnic tables, everything. So it becomes more of a nuisance pest in an urban setting or a suburban setting than an agricultural pest, but it's still a nuisance pest. Vineyard losses are our highest concern, followed by orchards. Environmental impacts on forests and forest products. We still don't really know that. There's some research going on in Pennsylvania as well as in New York and also by Rutgers in New Jersey. So we're not sure about what the environmental impacts could be as far as that goes, but we have seen vineyard losses in Pennsylvania. There's many things that feed on grapes. There's not very many things that kill grapes. Spotted lanternfly in one season can kill grapevines. Some varieties, some types of grapes are more susceptible than others, but it's rare that a pest would wipe out, they kill the plant versus just damage it. I mentioned the vineyard losses. Nationally, New York ranks third in grape production, especially in your area. I'm sure you're well familiar with the grape industry in the Finger Lakes there. Orchard impacts, you have quite a few of those too. Nationally, New York ranks second in apple production, only second to Washington State. And when I say we rank third in grape production, we trail Pennsylvania and, of course, California. Everyone's dwarfed by California, but everyone sometimes is surprised by the amount of grapes and apples that New York produces. For the past 15, 20 years, we've been encouraging folks to grow and plant hops again in New York State, especially for some of the local breweries. They want locally grown hops, and so that'll be impacted as well. Some of the forest and forest product impacts, maple syrup is one thing we're concerned about, and also forest regeneration. The very young stages of spotted lanternfly, they don't have very big mouth parts. Like I mentioned, they have piercing mouth parts, so they can't go through the bark even on a mature grapevine at that point, but they can certainly feed on the tender new growth of some other plants. And if you have a very young, 2-year-old sapling of maple or black walnut, they'll go to that and damage it. So we don't know what those long-term impacts are going to be as far as forest regeneration. So where is spotted lanternfly? It's not everywhere, but it's getting there. It's getting close. It started in Berks County, Pennsylvania. I don't know if you can see my cursor, but Berks County is right over here. So you can see kind of if that's the epicenter, it's slowly spread out from there, middle of kind of central eastern Pennsylvania, and it's slowly spread out. You can see some of the outliers further out in like Tennessee and Illinois, Indiana, Michigan. Those it didn't fly there on its own. The New York spread, yes, some of it was human assisted, accidental introductions, hitchhikers as we call them. However, it is also spreading now that it's a dense population. They have some ability to fly pretty good distances, more so than we initially thought. But these other outlier areas in the other states, those were accidental movements of either mature gravid females or pregnant females or eggs, because they hitchhike really well in all life stages. They can hitchhike as an adult, they can hitchhike as an egg mass, or they can hitchhike as a juvenile nymph. So unfortunately, they will lay eggs on absolutely anything. Any flat surface outside is fair game, so they spread pretty easily that way, and they do have some ability to fly. So currently it's in 17 states. So when we zoom in, and I know it's not the best map, but you get the general idea. It's a patchwork, it's slowly being connected and the dots being filled in. I know that we started off the year in 2024 with it not being present very much in the Finger Lakes, and it was found in Seneca County towards the end of the summer. We expect that between the natural spread of it, flying to new locations and slow movement of accidental spread, that some of the gaps between these blue positive counties will probably start to fill in. Just because a county is lit up blue does not mean the entire county is covered in spotted lanternfly. I mean, yes, that's the case if you're in, say, Richmond County, which is Staten Island, or down on Long Island, and Nassau County, or any of the New York City or lower Hudson Valley. Yes, it's pretty much all over the county. However, like Ithaca and Tompkins County or near Syracuse, there's very small patches, but it's present in that county. There's a viable population in that county. So currently, of the 64 counties we have in New York State, it's in almost half, or so it's in 27 counties. The most recently added were Rensselaer, Livingston, and Seneca, and I'm sure you all saw the news reports of it being detected in Seneca County. And those were all introduced. Those 3 counties were added this year. in 2024. And the left side there, you can see two of the three life stages. There's 3 or 4 egg masses up on the top right. She's presently laying a very fresh egg mass there. It's very white colored. And then just past her, that little gray patch is also a covered egg mass. Some of the eggs are covered, some of them aren't. I'll touch on that a little bit later. But what I like about this photo is how easily it blends in with the lichen on the tree. It looks just like a patch of mud, but also when she first lays the egg mass and she does cover it, she doesn't always cover the eggs. It'll be white and then it'll fade to this gray color. And then if you look at the top right corner there, that one's even a little bit lighter. It's not quite white, but it's almost tan. So that the color of these egg masses is quite variable. They differ from spongy moth that these look like dried mud. They don't have, it's a very different texture where um, spongy moth looks more like paper mache, looks very fuzzy. So these have more of a mud texture to them, but they're about the same shape and size as spongy moth eggs. So again, the life cycle, we'll start off with the eggs. They can be covered or not covered. The covered one on the left is pretty fresh. It's still glossy, but she got a little lazy toward the end there or got interrupted and didn't cover the whole egg mass. So they're not necessarily always completely covered. On the right, it looks like someone glued sesame seeds or caraway seeds rather to the tree, and they have this little ridge down the center. If that little ridge is open, they're last year's eggs and they've already hatched. If that seam is intact, they're still viable eggs. But about 70% are usually covered and 30% are uncovered, but that's variable. At first, it was thought that they needed Tree of Heaven to reproduce. That is not true. They produce much better. They have much more vibrant survivability rates, higher survivability rates if they reproduce and feed using Tree of Heaven. However, they can complete their life cycle on other plants like maple. They prefer, of the maples, they prefer silver maple and red maple, and we have those throughout the state. So yeah, so removing Atlantis is not going to defeat this pest, unfortunately. When they hatch out, they're very tiny, tick-like. They're black and white. They're very beautiful insects. However, the nymphs will hatch out in late April, early May, probably in your area in May. A little bit early, depending on where you are in a valley, how close you are to the lake and the little microclimates. But they hatch out, and they always kind of hunch back on their back legs because they are plant hoppers. They like to hop. They can walk around, but at this stage they can't fly, but they can certainly hop. And they have back legs that are like springs. If they're approached or disturbed, they will flick off. And yeah. So when they're first hatched, they're really tiny, probably about the size of the center of the zero, the where it says early May, like the center part of that A. That's how tiny they are when they first hatch. Very, very tiny, very much like ticks. But they grow pretty quickly. They go through 4 metamorphosis stages. The fourth nymph stage will look like this in the right side there with the red wing pads and red markings. At that point, they're about 1/2 inch in diameter, much easier to see, much easier to spot in the environment. And at that point, they'll start to congregate more in groups. One other thing about the early life stages is they always like to, even as adults, they like to climb up tall structures, but especially the first hatched ones, they will climb up tall structures, whether it's a tree, a house, a building. They're not trying to eat your house, but what they're doing is they're trying to get to the top of something so that they can launch themselves off to disperse themselves. Because if they are all feeding in the same location, their food sources get used up very quickly. So as a survival technique, they've developed this habit of climbing up tall structures and launching themselves off into the wind because they're so tiny. And wherever they land, they'll start feeding on whatever they can. They're not very selective at that point, but as they mature, they become more and more selective of what they want to eat. So if you, even at the later nymph stages, before they turn red and white, or even at that stage, if you have a maple tree and a tree of heaven and a black walnut, they will be on that black walnut, not the tree of heaven, but on the black walnut. for whatever reason. So if you have small seedlings around, that's just something to key in on. It doesn't, you don't always have to survey tree of heaven. They can be on other plants as well, is my point. So once they're more easily viewed and spotted in the environment, when they have these red wing pads, they finally go through their final metamorphosis and they emerge as adults. At that point, they continue to feed. That's usually around July, in the heat of the summer. Start finding adults, and then they'll start massing together. You won't find initially. You'll find ones and twos, and as the infestation grows, as the population grows, you will find hundreds, if not thousands, of them. I mean, you saw earlier there was the photo of the four impacts, and there was a tree, and the trunk of that tree was just covered in spotted lanternfly adults. That type of massing is what you see. They are just absolutely covering, coating surfaces. And they climb up, they get scared, they fall down, they climb up, they get scared, they fall down. It's kind of a habit of theirs, but it lends themselves to trapping. I'll talk about that a little bit in a minute. So at that stage, when they're massing like that, they're very easy to spot in the environment. However, early on in an infestation, when there's only a dozen or two, they are hard to spot. But so sometimes a population can be present and not found until they get to higher populations, and that's been the case in say Rochester or in Binghamton. We've seen that happen where the infestation's been there for a year or two, but not detected because the populations were low. And it gets to that third or fourth year when the population really explodes. Currently, what we're at now is, February, March, we're in the egg stage. However, a very short period of time, I hope, is I'm looking for some warmer weather. I think we all are at this point. April's right around the corner, and egg masses will start to hatch out. In the Finger Lakes, it's probably the end of April. Really depends on the year, but the winter that we're having so far, at least on the eastern part of the state, I'm right on the Vermont border, about an hour north of Albany. And by me, we're getting single digits next week. So right now, we're just worrying about the eggs. So again, on the left side, there's the egg masses. And then April, May, you'll start to see the nymphs. What's really interesting about that picture of the early instar nymph there, that picture is really zoomed in. I don't know if you can see that little brown thing that it's perched on, getting ready to launch itself from. That is a spruce needle. So a spruce tree, the little needles on a spruce tree, that's sitting, it's perched on the end of a spruce tree needle. That's just a zoomed in photo. It's not that size. They get bigger as they metamorphosize, and they'll go through different instars. So each time they metamorphosize and they grow to the next stage, they lose their outer skin, their exoskeleton, and they kind of emerge a little bit bigger. And then the fourth time they look red. That's really when people start to notice them. The adults are 3/4 of an inch to an inch long. They're beautiful insects. Other than the eggs are kind of nondescript, but the other life stages are pretty beautiful. When the wings are folded, they have this pinkish hue, the beautiful little spots. When they're spread out, when their wings are spread out, which is a lot of the advertising, or especially early on, it looks like a butterfly or a moth. Those red wings are kind of folded underneath the front wings, but it gives this pinkish hue when the adults are walking around, and that's how you're more likely to see it. As I mentioned, you're more likely to see it like this from the side or dorsal view or the top view. You'll see the wings. The front will be completely black. There's a few other things, native things, that look similar to this, but these are pretty distinct looking and pretty easy for most people to determine and identify. But they're really beautiful insects. I feel like insects. I know all insects creep out some people, but and I'm not an entomologist. I've worked quite a bit with insects, but they're beautiful little insects, but don't want them in the U.S. So again, the adult stage, a lot of the advertising, you see this beautiful spot here where their wings are spread. One thing I like about this photo is that it's kind of unique, is the right wing does not match the left wing. It's a slight variation in color, and that's kind of rare. but most of the time you'll see them like this one here perched on. I thought it was grapevine. I'm not sure what that is. It's kind of hard to tell. But again, they kind of hunch back on their back legs and they use those springy back legs to just launch themselves. The adults will hop before they'll walk. They'll walk around if they have to, but if they get scared, they will hop and then they will fly. Here's a great top view how it blends in with the lichen on the tree. A little pictogram here on a depiction of an ailanthus stem, kind of going through their life stages. And you can see how the egg mass is on the bottom of the twig. They like protected areas. So if you're looking at a branch, the bottom side is more likely where you're going to find the egg masses. They can be anywhere, but they will first lay in protected areas. And as those areas are taken up with other egg masses, they'll spread kind of around the edge of the stem. But the undersides of branches, so if you're just kind of looking around and you're looking down at it, you might not see it. You really got to get in there and poke around. I mentioned they're really good hitchhikers. Here's an adult getting ready to jump in that open pickup truck window. Um, and this photo was taken in Pennsylvania by folks being toured around an area, kind of a training situation, and somebody didn't close the window. So it doesn't take much for that insect to climb in the window if it's left open. So in known positive infested areas, just little cautionary things like keeping the windows rolled up, things like that, will reduce the chances of accidental hitchhiking. So I mentioned gravid females or pregnant females. This is what they look like. So the females will have these yellow pleats. The one on the right, either she's already laid some of her eggs or she's not quite ready to lay eggs yet. But those pleats kind of fold over each other, those body panels, and as the eggs develop, she gets bigger and bigger and bigger. As you know, if you've seen a pregnant puppy, they look pretty big, or a goat. The same thing with these insects. As their stomach, as the eggs develop, her abdomen kind of swells, and you can see these yellow pleats. The males do not have these yellow pleats, only the females. The one on the left is not the best photo, but that's about as big as they get. She is prime and ready to start laying eggs. So whoever collected that one saved many, many spotted lanternflies from being in the environment. Each egg mass holds anywhere from 30 to 70 eggs, and they can lay multiple egg masses. There's some debate on how many egg masses, but so each pregnant female lays hundreds of egg masses. Hundreds of eggs. Here's an egg mass on a lanthus tree. I don't know if you can spot that. It blends right in. Lanthus trees, especially young ones, have this like cantaloupe texture to their bark. And right in the middle there's an egg mass. So it's very difficult to spot sometimes. And this one's probably ground level, but if you get up in the tree canopy, about 30% of the egg masses are found down below, and about 70% are found up in the top of the tree. Because again, they do like to gravitate towards the top of the tree. That's where most of the smaller twigs are. They're doing their feeding, their breeding, and all that up there. So if you're finding the egg masses down below, there's probably many more up top. I mentioned protected areas. Here's an image and a close-up, another shot of the same image. Some cat facing or wound wood on this tree. Looks like it could be a maple. Sorry, that was my dog in the background. So they will lay eggs on underneath side of things, behind bark, behind these protected areas to protect their egg masses. So you take a quick walk around the tree. Oh, I don't see anything on the outside of it, but where this wound was, the bark kind of grew over a little bit, and there's several egg masses underneath of there. Here's another shot of a female. It looks like she was interrupted laying those egg masses, the eggs, and the egg mass on the right is not complete. It looks like she's trying to walk away. However, the one above her to the left is completely covered and ready to hatch. Not ready to hatch, but ready to be moved on, and that will probably hatch the following year. They have one generation a year. Here's another couple of quick shots. So not every egg mass has the full amount of eggs. Here she kind of got lazy and missed a couple strips and then put the covering on it next to it. Or there's another egg mass under there. The ones on the bottom left, there's an old egg mass and a new egg mass. The one on the right has not hatched. The one on the left, you can see those little ridges in the middle have been open. So those have already hatched, or at least some of them have already hatched. Um, they're attracted to rusty metal for whatever reason. If there's rusty metal available and it's in a protected spot, you're more likely to find it there than on a rock or a piece of wood. For whatever reason, they like those spots for laying eggs. This tire and rim here was laying on the ground. When it was flipped up, you can see all the egg masses, and I think there's another egg mass up on the right that's not even circled. But underneath things is really the place to look. Here's a good shot to show how small they are. And this is the top of someone's patio chair, leaning up against the stucco wall. And you can see 3 first instar nymphs. They just like tiny little dots. And that's not blown up. That's real life size. They're just really, really tiny. So when they first hatch, they're that difficult to find. Second instar on the right here, they're a little easier to spot, but they're still pretty tiny. Black and white, again, very much like a tick, about the size of a tick. Here, there was someone had a banner or something tied to a tree, so it stands out. But if it was on the bark of the tree, like on the right, they're a little bit harder to see. Here, they're probably third instar, I would say. Nymphs, they're getting a little bit bigger and they're starting to mass together. The older they get, the more they're likely to be exhibit that massing behavior. They're not necessarily swarming; it's different than bees, but they do mass together and they congregate for multiple. We don't know exactly why, but in multiple stages they'll do that. Here's some newly hatched ones climbing up an ailanthus tree, or at least the stem, but you can see that new succulent growth there. So that's something that they could feed on, where those little insects would not be able to feed on that mature ailanthus tree on the right. However, the fourth instar ones can certainly get their mouth parts through that bark. And both of these are ailanthus trees, just ones obviously that later on in the year, you can see the leaves are starting to shrivel up versus the tender new growth in the spring. Rare photo on the left side there. When they first hatch, when they first molt, they will exit their exoskeleton and they're almost clear. So that little reddish insect there with the black eyes and the yellow beak, that will harden off within a few minutes to another black and white, I'm guessing second instar insect. And here you can also see multiple generations, fourth instars and adults. Sometimes you see adults and third and fourth star insects all in the same spot. It's not all the eggs hatch at the same time. So. The adults emerge, as I mentioned, in the summer. However, you're more likely to see them like on this grapevine here on the right than you do with their wings spread open. I mentioned about the jumping and flying. Individuals can move up to 3 to 4 miles between jumping, flying, walking. They're pretty good, and they won't necessarily go from one object to another. They can fly over trees to the next group of trees. They're not very selective with that. In some research in orchards, they had traps set up in the first 2 or 3 rows of the orchard, expecting the insects to move from the tree line into the orchard, and they flew over the test plot deep into the orchard. So they're not flying directly to the nearest food source. They're kind of flying beyond that and dispersing themselves. But hitchhiking is certainly the most common way that they can move long distances. Again, survey tips mention rusty material in protected areas. So this barrel has got a couple ribs on it. If you look at the edge of the rib, you can see there's egg masses there. Another curious thing that they do is once they lay an egg mass, others are attracted to laying more egg masses in that same spot. So once those protected areas get filled up, they'll start to spread out into the unprotected areas. So the underside of that midrib or that rib on that barrel Those places, the prime real estate was taken up. So then, it's not beachfront property, but it's maybe second row. So they'll go to those second areas and start to fill in the gaps. Um, Again, with the egg masses, they're not always covered, but these blend in really well with the bark. I'm guessing this is probably a cherry tree. It's hard to tell. But you can also see the looks like moisture running down the tree, and I suspect that is honeydew running down the trunk of the tree due to a heavy infestation and from feeding damage. The covering again will be variable in texture and color. Looks almost like putty or mud that's starting to dry, so that's an older egg site. Um, Vehicles and transportation corridors, like the underside of this rail here, there's one egg mass on the other side of the railroad track. No one's going to pick that railroad track up and move it, but if they park a railroad car there and these eggs hatch, or an adult lays the eggs on the railroad track, it's going to lay the eggs on the railroad car. Same goes for this tractor trailer. Around the sides, there's nothing, no visible egg masses whatsoever. However, if you look underneath the taillight housing where it's all protected, there's rusty metal, and lo and behold, there's egg masses, multiple egg masses. So that wasn't one female that laid those, that was multiple females that were attracted to that spot. The same goes for this camp chair, which could easily just be picked up from someone's backyard and brought to a campsite or a sporting event or a concert or whatever. They're bringing it from their house to their lakefront property. That's the thing that we fear the most, is eggs being accidentally transported on recreational equipment. Many of the initial sites in other parts of the state were in or near recreational parking areas for trailheads, canoe launches, things like that, campgrounds. So it's a very real threat that recreational equipment is moving these things around. This pest and others. However, this chair was laying on the ground again when it was picked up. These were protected areas. The top part of this chair was all folded up, laying on the ground. No visible signs of infestation. However, you pick it up off the ground, and there's more than a half dozen egg masses right there. So that's several hundred new spotted lanternfly if that chair is moved to a new location, and it only takes two. One of the tools that have been used, I had a close-up picture of that egg mass on the underside of the rail. Here is Dia, the detection dog. Linda mentioned the prism. So in your area, it's the Finger Lakes prism. There are 8 prism regions throughout New York State. The Lower Hudson prism is sponsored by the New Jersey Trail Conference, and they have detector dogs. They have Dia, they have Fagin, and they have a new puppy. Well, I say new, it's like 2 years old now. But last time I saw the dog, she was a puppy. I don't know that dog's name, but they're trained to detect, just like a drug sniffing dog or a cadaver sniffing dog. They're trained to specific scents of specific invasive species. And those dogs have been trained for spotted lanternfly. In a heavily infested area, they get kind of overwhelmed and they can't determine where it is. But in a low infested area, um, especially in a setting like this, in places that are very difficult, if not impossible, for us to see, their nose knows. They know that there's a spot there underneath that railroad track. We would have to inspect that with an inspectional mirror, like they do at truck checkpoints. Um, but the dogs can get into nooks and crevices and crannies that we can't, and they can do it much more quickly and more efficient. So it's just another tool in our toolbox. Another tool that we hand out frequently are these little scraper cards. They're about the size of a credit card or a business card. They're plastic, and they're used, like in this picture, for scraping the egg masses off. It's best to scrape them off into plastic bags with hand sanitizer or rubbing alcohol to kill them, because if you scrape them off onto the ground, you'll kill some of them, but you're not likely to kill all of them, and they can survive on the ground. Um, so the scraper cards are a great tool. And we've given out literally thousands of those over the years. Um, so the bags of the dead eggs, those can be double bagged, or you can put alcohol and hand sanitizer to kill them. They can also be put in a freezer. I know that freaks some people out. My ex-wife was horrified the first time we met, and she went to go put ice cream away and found bottles of dead insects in the freezer, but some people don't mind that. So why bother with all the egg scraping? Here's a little diagram. So, yep, 74 million. So that's quite a bit of eggs. But over the course of 5 years, if you scrape 35%, if you're only eliminating 35%, you're still knocking back the population by 64 billion. So even though egg masses, scraping egg masses is not going to kill every single one, it has a huge impact. One of the other things I mentioned was trapping. Not all, but many insects. The best way and most efficient way is traps. Traps are there 24 hours a day. When you're out visually surveying, you're only there for a very short period of time of the day, and you're not there. Maybe you're not there at the right time of day or the right day. So even the detector dogs, they could have sniffed that spot today, and then a new egg mass gets laid tomorrow, and you miss that spot. The traps are up 24 hours a day during the proper seasons. We call these. So the other ones were bucket traps. These are funnel traps. So basically, the insects crawl up and down the tree. As I mentioned, they'll climb up, they'll jump off, get scared, fall down, and climb up. So that behavior lends themselves to being trapped with these traps, even though there's no lure. There's no effective lure. We've tried all kinds of things. There's no attractant, no lure for these, but the traps still work. Circle traps. Sorry, I think I call them funnel traps. They're circle traps because they circle around the tree. So the netting, the wood kind of holds it in place. The netting is forms like a funnel. It filters the insects, kind of funnels them into this plastic bag. Sometimes it's a plastic jug, and those can be taken away and destroyed. This looks like a tree of heaven. It's hard to tell. It's definitely tree of heaven on the right, but it doesn't have to be a tree of heaven. It could be on the tree next to it. So just because you don't have tree of heaven doesn't mean you can't use these traps. There's from this QR link, there is a link to Penn State's design for building your own traps. They are also available commercially. We can't recommend one company over the other. Another tool in our toolbox. Okay, cue the Ghostbusters theme now, because we've used vacuums. It's been a tool that's been used for many years for insect collection, but not necessarily large scale management. And we're not going to wipe it out from the forest. We're not vacuuming up every insect, every tree. However, in areas where you can't use pesticides and the population is still relatively low, and we have extension poles so we can reach up 20, 30 feet with these. They're pretty effective, and there's no pesticides. The vortex function of the vacuum kills most of the insects, if not all of them, as it's spinning around pretty violently. They're actually relatively good, easy insects to kill. Catching them is the hard part. So we do have used to some success these vacuums, backpack battery powered vacuums, like you would use in your shop, to vacuum up some of the insects. It works great on the juveniles as well as the adults. A lot of pesticides only target certain life stages. And again, so this is a method that can be used, even on sites near schools and playgrounds and daycare centers, things like that. That again, reduces the population. It's not going to eliminate it. It's not a cure-all, but it's just another tool in the toolbox. People talk about trap trees quite a bit, and that was a technique that was used early on. So since April in 2019, trap trees are not recommended. The theory is that there's male and female Atlantis trees, so you remove all the females so they're not spreading more seed. You leave a few of the larger standing males, you treat those with pesticides, and you kill off the insects. However, um, removing all, or either using the trap trees or removing all the trees of heaven, what that'll do is just drive the insects to other plants that are more desirable. So again, host tree removal, limited and low population areas. There's a railroad right of way here with some very small tree of heaven. In a situation like that, where there's a risk of spread and a host plant right there, that might make sense. But again, they're small trees, not expensive to remove. It's a right-of-way area where they're going to be cleared anyway. So in some aspects, some places, tree removal makes a little bit of sense, but it's usually associated with risk of dispersal. This railroad bed that's in the background, I don't know if you can see that rail bed there. Certainly it poses a risk. So that was all the bad news. So some good news. Bavaria bassiana and Baccoa major are naturally occurring fungal pathogens of insects and of spotted lanternfly. Um, Bavaria has actually been created as a biopesticide for other insects and is now labeled for use in New York State only by certified applicators, but it's still another tool in the toolbox. Um, and again, these are both naturally occurring in New York State. More research is going on about Batcoa and how we can use that to our advantage. However, these pathogens are out there, and we do hear, especially this past year, we heard several reports of mass die-offs, and sure enough, it was these two fungal pathogens that were the cause of those mass die-offs. But it's a very localized area, and the humidity and temperature conditions have to be correct. But we'll take every little bit of good news that we can get. For assistance in selecting pesticides, very much like Box Tree Moth, I'm going to refer you to Cornell Integrated Pest Management. They house the map that I showed earlier of where it's being spread in where it's been found in New York State, and also the list of approved pesticides, along with a wealth of other information. I think they also have a link for purchasing and making of the traps. So those options are all there. Chemical treatments, we've done some. We've had some contractors, specifically in Ithaca and Lower Hudson. We actually contracted the Prism, who conducted some pesticide applications. The DEC intended to do some treatments in bananas. I don't think those happened at the end of the season. That we had some issues there. Not necessarily with the property access issues versus issues with the pesticide. But there are chemical treatments that are available. Again, it's another tool in the toolbox, some that's not preferred by many folks. However, some of the things like the Bavaria-based pesticides are things that are naturally occurring in the environment, but because they've been commercialized into a biopesticide, you have to have a certified applicator apply those. But there are some that are available to homeowners. There's all sorts of crazy concoctions that people put together and suggest, and blow torches and all sorts of chemical mixes, and not recommended because there's unintended consequences and they're not safe. Anything that's safe, legal, and registered to use in New York State is listed on the Cornell IPM site. And that site looks just like this. Here's a screenshot. So here's they have links for trapping and how to destroy egg masses and why we don't use trap trees. Sticky bands are another type of trap that we don't recommend because of bycatch, which is the accidental catching of other things, whether they're other insects and birds and chipmunks and things like that. Not recommended. The circle traps work best. There are some biocontrols. I mentioned the bacteria that's naturally occurring, and also vacuums. But there's also much more information than what I've given on the biology and life cycle and visuals of the damage that they cause. We ask that people in the list of counties not in your area not report them because we know they're there. And I mentioned before about some counties are completely covered in spotted lanternfly. This would be the list of counties. We know it's there. Those report, if people flood our box with these reports, we can't get to the new reports and rapidly respond to new introductions. Again, so if you live outside the counties on the map, you can still look. It can still be found. Take a photo, collect a sample, place it in a freezer if you're allowed to do that in your household. Also in a jar of rubbing alcohol or hand sanitizer, just like the eggs, and contact us. I can share this. Oh, I tried to share it with too many slides. You can contact us. We have a reporting tool. You can also use IMAP invasives, and those reports get filtered to us. However, there's a little bit of a delay when they're reported through IMAP invasives, so we can respond quicker. It's better to use our Spotted Lanternfly responder tool. Again, it's just a few quick questions, some survey, location data, where is it? What tree was it on? If you knew, the address, GPS location, and most importantly, photos. There are a few things that look like these, they're not. Box elder bug is one of the things that often gets confused with this because the coloring is very similar and they emerge around the same time. But they're pretty easily determined by most people if they spot an ironfly. Once you've collected it, you can kill any initial SLFs by stepping on them, crushing them. Stomping them is always a good option for the adults and the nymphs. I mentioned IMAP invasive, so that's the official database for New York State for invasive species. The prisms use it. The 9 state agencies on the Invasive Species Council use it, and we can track positive locations for spotted lanternfly here and other pests as well. So this is where it's known. Just a little bit of highlight some of the survey populations that we've done. This gets a little confusing with the green pluses and red pluses. So one of the other tools that we have is eDNA sampling, environmental DNA sampling, where plants and surfaces are swabbed for DNA evidence that the insect or parts of the insect have been there. It's not a perfect tool, but it indicates that the DNA for that insect has been there. So if a bird eats or a wing breaks off of a dead insect, those can give positive eDNA samples, especially honeydew and things like that. So just because there's a positive eDNA sample does not mean there's a population. But all the red counties are positives. So you can see that there's some red pluses and dots outside of those areas where we've had suspects. But there's no population been found in those areas. Again, eDNA sampling is just another tool that we've used. We've done some of that sampling with the DEC, and we've also done some of that sampling with Rutgers. And actually Cornell has also done some of that sampling. Specific to the Finger Lakes, here are the detections along Seneca Lake that we're aware of. The yellow part is a buffer, but these are the areas where we've concentrated, even though Seneca County is lit up, it's colored in that, yes, it's positive. It's not the entire county, but these are the 3 locations that we know that are positive SLF locations at this time. So right near Seneca and Geneva. And the great folks at the Lower Hudson Prism, there was actually staff members were the first ones to report this, and they've had many volunteers out there helping survey along with our horticulture inspectors. And we appreciate all that work. So my take-home messages for this, so we're currently looking for egg masses, but as the season changes, that will change. Flat protected areas, think under and behind. They love rusty metal. And negative is good. I say that because negative survey is good. So if you survey an area and find nothing, that data is important because we know it's been checked at least once. But if that's reported in IMAP invasives, because you can report negative data, not necessarily just because you found something, you can survey an area and report negative data in IMAP invasives. So that negative data is good. So we know, okay, it's been looked for here, not found. But what about this area over here that no one's ever looked at? Maybe we should go concentrate there. So it helps us direct our resources in better, more efficient use of staff and resources. So that's what I mean by negative is good. I want to mention one other pest. I mentioned European hornets. So they're attracted to the honeydew. We have had 3,200 reports of this pest. I will not refer to it as this. The accepted common name is currently northern giant hornet. We do not have any in New York State. There is none in the United States at this time. It's been eradicated from Washington State. It has been eradicated from Canada. But every year, its European cousin, the European hornet, they're the same genus, different species. So the European hornet is Vespa crabro versus Vespa mandarinia. But Vespa crabro has been in New York State since the 1840s. Generally, they're kind of mind their own business. They're introduced. They're not invasive. They're not destructive. They do pollination services, so they're positive that way. They eat a lot of other bad insects, so that they help us that way. However, they are a big black, yellow, and stripy, and they're quite large, and people get panicked when they see them as they think they're their Asian cousins. Just keep that in mind if you are surveying and you have a large infestation and you see something that's big, black, and yellow, and stripy, it might not be this pest. It could be just European hornets, nothing to panic over. However, we do have a reporting tool, just like the others. And if you do suspect that it is the northern giant hornet, which is much larger than the European hornet, the head looks like a kid's Lego toy. It's quite orange or yellow versus orange body. The stripes on the European hornet have those little paint drips that drip down into the yellow section, where the striping on the abdomen on the northern giant hornet is very crisp, very straight lines. Not a very good shot here, but the face on the northern giant hornet, the whole head is yellow, bright yellow, like a kid's toy. It looks clownish. Where the face on the straight on view from the European hornet, it's yellow underneath by the jaw and like a chestnut brown on top up by the eyes. But we do get these reported quite often, and when we have that heavy honeydew situation, especially in the fall, some of these insects turn up. When I say these insects, I mean the European hornets. Their other cousin, also native to Asia, is yellow-legged hornet. We do not have any of these in New York State. However, Georgia and South Carolina have removed close to 100 nests in the past 2 years. They were introduced through the port of Savannah or near the port of Savannah, and slowly spread into Georgia from there. Sorry, from Georgia into South Carolina. However, the area in South Carolina is a swampy area. They build their nests about 80 feet up in a tree, and they're gigantic nests, like 3 feet tall, huge, huge nests. But these look more like yellow jackets that are more common. However, just mentioning this, but it is another invasive species. And again, it's the same genus, it's Velutina, same genus, different species. Not likely to find these in New York, but it's possible, much more possible than northern giant hornets. And I hope I didn't run over and I have time for questions. I did. I ran way over. I am so sorry. I just realized what time it was. So sorry.